So with that, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the point where I'm honored to welcome our keynote speaker. The title of her presentation is Investing in Biodiversity in a Risk-Prone World. Lucy Emerton is an environmental economist, and she specializes in a very important, an increasingly important, actually you can't underestimate its importance, a specialization known as ecosystem valuation and the design and development of conservation finance and incentive mechanisms key to what we stand for as businesses involved or engaged in biodiversity protection. She is currently Economics and Finance Director of the Environmental Management Group. It's a consultancy group and a think tank. Over the last 30 years, she has worked as technical and policy advisor for several governments, non-government agencies, the United Nations, private sector organizations across more than 70 countries, including DFID, GIZ, UNDP, UNEP, World Bank, WCS, WWF, UNDP, and the African Wildlife Foundation. Between 1998 and 2008, she established and led environmental economics programs for IUCN in Africa, Asia, and at the global level. The presentation will be followed by a Q&A. With that, Lucy, may I welcome you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm sharing my screen, so I rely on somebody to let me know if you can't see it. Thank you very much for according me the honour of joining you. And what I would really like to do now is take a little bit of a step back from the excellent work we've been talking about and the very practical on-the-ground work that you've been doing at BSL. And let's all remind ourselves of the bigger picture of why these initiatives are so crucial and how they all link together. And indeed, think a little bit about why and how we need to push the boat out even further. I really want to work through 5 chapters, if you like. You know, we're seeing deteriorating biodiversity tastes and trends, and this is giving rise to some really serious risks and damages. We've got a substantial finance gap that we've got to fill in terms of biodiversity and ecosystems. Now, the returns to this investment are huge, as we all know. And so then where do we go from here? Given the appalling status of biodiversity, given the economic costs and risks and damages it's giving rise to, given the amazing investments that are taking place on the ground, how do we push it further? I want to really do 4 things. I want to give an economist's perspective, because that's not something we often see in relation to biodiversity. I'd like to share some of the most recent data and evidence on biodiversity status and trends with you, and climate as well, because there have been some really interesting new publications and studies and reports and global assessments coming out over the last few months and years. I'd like to consider what are the business risks and opportunities associated with this, going with the BSL themes of building back better and biodiversity for business, and then pose the question to you, because you're actually the experts in this room, in this virtual room, what's actually required to address these risks and opportunities better? And particularly, how do we bring together this triad that you've highlighted as well of private, public, and community? So the trends, these worryingly deteriorating trends that we've been seeing over recent years, I'd like to draw your attention to 3 really important assessment reports which have come out over the last year or 2. 2 by IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and 1 by WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, the Living Planet Report. And what do these show us? They put figures to some of the trends that we've seen so alarmingly take place. they actually confirm what we've been seeing, that a massive percentage of most habitats and biomes have been converted over the last 50 years or so. They confirm that our ecological footprint has been exceeding the Earth's biocapacity for many years now. This is very interesting. This is from the Living Planet report that WWF has just published, where they've actually quantified the green dotted line, which is the Earth's biocapacity to support us, and then all the different aspects of our footprint on the planet, our carbon footprint, our land, fishing, forest, grazing and cropland footprint. And it's very worrying to see that since the early 70s, we've been exceeding this biocapacity. We've been exceeding it by a lot. Our global stock of natural capital has declined by nearly 40% just over the last 20 or 30 years. And we're now estimated, according to these latest figures, to be overusing the Earth's biocapacity by almost 60%. Biodiversity change. We've also got the latest figures on what's happening to different aspects of biodiversity, what's happening to species, to extinctions, to habitats, to biodiversity. And I think this top left graph, the Living Planet Index, which is a composite of species populations, really gives pause for thought. Just since the 1970s, the population sizes of most species has decreased by more than 2/3. We're also finding out, and this is from the IPBES global assessment of biodiversity that's just been completed, they assessed in detail what have been the global trends in 18 key ecosystem services over the last 50 years. 14 of these 18 assessed services have declined since 1970. And actually the only ones which haven't have been the industrially produced services such as energy, food, materials, and so on. So all of this is critically interlinked. You know, just as we were hearing about the mangroves at Puttalam, which bring together the idea of biocapacity with the ideas of biodiversity and species habitat and ecosystem services, all of these plugs in and does its bit to address the very worrying trends that we're getting more and more evidence and data about at the global level. I think we can't look at biodiversity without considering climate change. As Roshan was saying, this is linked both in terms of climate adaptation and climate mitigation. And just last month, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released the first stage of its 6th assessment report. Periodically, the IPCC gives us assessment reports on climate change. The last one was in 2013, 2014. The latest one is just coming out. And this physical science basis assessment is hot off the press. And again, the numbers are fascinating, but worrying. They confirm that we now know that human-induced temperature rise has been skyrocketing since the pre-industrial 1850 baseline. Over the next 20 years, we're expected to reach or exceed 1.5 degrees of warming unless we really take radical action, such as BSL is helping to foment in Sri Lanka. These bullet points down the side confirm, you know, over the last 4 decades, each decade has been successively warmer than any preceding decade. We're reaching our highest atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations than we've had in any time over the last 2 million years. Hot extremes are becoming hotter. Cold extremes are becoming less frequent. Rainfall's increasing. Major tropical cyclone occurrences are rising. We've been experiencing this, but we're starting to get the evidence and data to confirm it. And we're also starting to see that the effects of projected 1.5 degree change are affecting us all. I mean, this is worrying also if we look at Sri Lanka on any of these temperature global warming projection maps. we're definitely in the middle of a global warming band. We might not be at the worst extreme, but we're solidly into the red. And this doesn't just mean temperature effects, but actually means that we're reaching our critical tolerance thresholds, particularly for key areas like agriculture and health. Rainfall, precipitation is something we're seeing on a day-to-day basis, but this latest IP-based physical assessment report shows us that it's actually even more critical than we thought before. And particularly, the heavy precipitation and flooding across Asia has been flagged as a major concern. And the accompanying cyclones, storms, floods, sea level rise, coastal flooding, coastal erosion. This is something that's already a critical problem on a day-to-day basis. Well, unless we act, it ain't going to get any better. Okay, enough of the negatives. Let's actually think what the negatives mean. As I said, this is very much an economist's perspective. Yes, species loss, habitat loss is extremely worrying in its own right, in biodiversity terms, in biological and ecological terms, but it's also extremely worrying in economic terms. And there have been a number, again, of really interesting new reports and assessments coming out. One which has just come out from the World Economic Forum, one from the Economist Intelligence Unit, and then the Global Climate Risk Index, which is updated every year, has just come out with a new publication, which gives us some very interesting figures. This is the Climate Risk Index 2020. And if we look at the risk index and the rankings, and if we look at the countries which are in the top 10 risk placings, we can see something really worrying. If we look at number 6, which is that here in Sri Lanka, we're actually solidly in this top 10 most climate affected countries, according to the latest index. Now, maybe it's good news. The ranking has gone down from number 2 at risk to number 6 at risk. But the point remains that there's a high level of vulnerability. And if there's a high level of vulnerability, there's an extremely high economic risk that goes along with that. The Economist Intelligence Unit released these figures a couple of years ago saying, actually, what do these changing temperature trends mean in terms of impacts on global GDP? Well, actually substantial. Just over the next 30 years, we're looking at probably shaving about 3% off global GDP. And as you can see, these effects are felt all around the world. If we just look at one thing, this is figures just released by Munich Re, reinsurance company, looking at the natural disaster costs just over the last year. One manifestation of climate change, the loss of biodiversity, the deterioration of ecosystem services, a massive whopping $210 billion, and about 60% of these damages and losses were uninsured. So about 60% of these damages and losses are directly not going to be compensated, not going to be remediated, not going to be mitigated. That's extremely worrying. Biodiversity loss, it's a similar picture. This is a study that was done a few years ago as part of TEEB, the global initiative on the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. And it said, okay, what are the costs of inaction? What are the costs of failing to invest in biodiversity conservation? Again, the costs are very tangible, not just in biological and ecological terms, but also in economic terms. We've already lost a lot of services and economic production that we would have had biodiversity not been halted. And at these rates that we're going, this is going to continue, and these are going to be reaching into the trillions of euros or the trillions of dollars, and increasingly so. And of course, it's a major risk. It's really interesting to see. The World Economic Forum every year, you probably know, your leaders of business, issue this assessment of global risks, the Global Risks Report. This is partly based on objective data, and it's also partly based on the perceptions and rankings and surveys of various top companies around the world. In the 2021 Global Risks Assessment, climate action failure was ranked #1, and biodiversity loss was ranked #5 as the most concerning risks to business. And what the World Economic Forum has really flagged with this report is, we've designed our economic and financial systems for a certain level of risk. We've optimized them to operate at that level of risk. But these increasing hazards associated with biodiversity and climate deterioration mean that actually our systems are becoming highly vulnerable to stress and breakdown. And actually, we're close to physical and biological thresholds. And those societies or countries which are close to those thresholds are the most at risk. And those countries with the lower per capita GDP tend to be much more exposed to risks and also have climates and natural environments that are much closer to dangerous thresholds. So it's really interesting. If you look at the World Economic Forum risk assessment over time, you've got a matrix here. The vertical axis is the impact of the risk. The horizontal axis is the likelihood of the risk. And what we see is not only is biodiversity loss right up there in the top right-hand quadrant, i.e. the highest impact and the highest likelihood of occurring, but that has been increasing as the World Economic Forum conducts this risk assessment every year. Biodiversity loss has been moving up and up and up in terms of ranked business risk. It's really interesting to see by 2020, the only two business risks which are ranked higher are climate action failure and extreme weather, both of which are, of course, intimately linked to biodiversity loss. And somebody mentioned this earlier, the key systems, the knock-on impacts we're seeing when these thresholds are breached, reach at the core of our asset base, our production base, our capital base. It impacts on the thresholds of food systems, infrastructure assets, and biome shifts. And again, the probabilities and the likelihoods and the impacts and the incidents of these risks occurring and the damages and losses giving rise to are really quite sobering. Okay, we can halt it. I refuse to give another of these presentations that is just doom, gloom, and despondency. Yes, we need to remind ourselves of the doom, gloom, and despondency, but we have to remind ourselves that there is hope. There is actually the possibility for us to take action. But taking action requires finances, it requires investments, cash and in-kind investments, and there are still substantial financial gaps to be filled. I'll look at the country level, but let's look at the global level. As Shirani and others mentioned, we've set ourselves as a country, as companies, and as the world, a set of very ambitious plans and targets and commitments, and we're suffering from a critical lack of investment. These costs are big. The costs of achieving the IG targets associated with the Convention on Biodiversity are trillions of dollars. We're not close to that. A study was carried out to look at actually what is the annual investment in biodiversity conservation. It's about $52 billion a year, nowhere close to the hundreds of billions of dollars which are thought to be required to achieve the IG targets. Okay, we're moving beyond the IG targets now. We're moving into the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, the 2030 agenda, which is encouraging us, and this is something that they're grappling with at the Department of Wildlife Conservation, as in all national biodiversity and wildlife conservation agencies in all countries. How do we protect the 30% of the planet that we've committed to do so by 2030? It requires a huge investment. And again, that huge investment that's required is many times higher than what is actually currently being made available to support protected areas, about 6 times higher. That'll vary from country to country, but at the global level, taking all countries together, we need to up our investment in protected areas by about 6 times if we're going to reach that 30% by 2030 target. The Paris Climate Agreement we've referred to, again, we're looking at a necessity of investing almost $7 trillion a year at the global level. And as for the Sustainable Development Goals, something which concerns the public sector and the corporate sector alike, the annual financing gap was estimated about $2.5 trillion until last year. But of course, everything's changed. That's why you're looking at building back better. So now actually it's estimated that developing countries face an additional shortfall of about $1.7 trillion for the SDGs as governments and private investors grapple with all the impacts of the COVID crisis. It's interesting, I saw that you were with Ramita and UNDP at one of your other sessions looking at biodiversity finance. I'm sure he referred to the biofin work that UNDP had been carrying out and actually looked at, well, what's the biodiversity finance gap in Sri Lanka? We've seen at a global level, the biodiversity finance gap is about $115 billion a year. In Sri Lanka, the biodiversity finance gap is calculated about $27 million a year, or 4.5 billion Lanka rupees, to fund the 4 national level action plans, which are directly related to biodiversity. So that includes protected areas, but it also includes the NDCs, it includes the IG targets, it includes the 2030 agenda, and so on. That money needs to come from somewhere. But, and again, let's look on the positive side. The potential returns to investment are huge. There's a huge economic value added, for example, from achieving the 30 by 30 targets, bringing 30% of the land and ocean area under conservation is going to leverage between $250 and $350 billion in increased economic output. That's a significant return on investment. Again, this is a very recent study just carried out last year to look actually at the costs and benefits of achieving this target. The shift to low carbon economy, think about the NDCs, think about the Paris Climate Agreement. Again, the benefits are it's not just the investment needs that are in the trillions of US dollars, it's also the benefits. And actually the benefits substantially outweigh the costs. Let's bring that down to a very specific level. What's this worth? What are Sri Lankan species, ecosystems, habitats worth? Well, the answer is, of course, they're priceless. You can't put a price on these incredibly valuable natural assets. But you can and we must make the point that there is also an economic value, a development value, a financial value. We are not only securing rare, endangered, and globally significant biodiversity and ecosystem services, this actually underpins the economy. We're seeing interesting figures to say, just for selected indicators, biodiversity and ecosystem services are critical. They underpin the economy. They underpin sectoral activity. And if we look at some of the classic case studies, just to take 3 examples, I focused on mangroves and coastal ecosystems because I can see that they're a major concern to BSL from the activities you're doing. Let's look at, for example, some of the evidence from Mutarajavela. Mutarajavela makes the classic case that biodiversity values are not just biological or ecological, they're also economic. Yes, the wetland is vital in terms of biodiversity, species, habitats, recreation, but it's much, much more than that. It's the breeding and nursery for fisheries and crustaceans. It purifies much of the water coming to it before it's released into Negombo Lagoon. It serves for flood control, energy supplies. It saves millions in costs and losses and damages avoided each year. Conservation is vital from the biological ecological side, but actually, what's going to happen to our economy if we don't? The case of Puttalam, and kudos for the excellent work you're doing in helping the Department of Wildlife Conservation with mangrove restoration and reforestation here. But we all know what's happened to the Puttalam Lagoon mangroves of the last few decades. They've been wholesale destroyed and converted for shrimp farms, for coconut, for salterns, and so on. And it makes the point that biodiversity degradation and conversion rarely makes good economic sense. This is a very interesting study. The losses in terms of ecosystem service loss from mangrove conversion since the early 1990s in Puttalam are actually almost 3 times higher than the income from the converted land uses. That doesn't make economic sense. Might make economic sense to the land developers, but certainly not to the bigger picture social perspective. Maya Estuary, like so many places, the threats posed by sand mining, often illegal and mainly unsustainable, well, it's the case in so many instances that the economic benefits of investing in conservation frequently outweigh the costs. So taking that bigger perspective, yes, the return on investment is a positive one, but how do we get those messages across? How do we make the business case? How do we mobilize that investment? So just working to the end, and the last question, thinking about that, thinking about these alarming trends that we're seeing evidence of from these assessments and reports and status reports, thinking about the costs and losses and damages, but also thinking about the immense value of investing in halting biodiversity loss and in tackling climate change. Where do we go from here? For sure, there is significant business opportunities. It's not just a public interest return that we get. There are also significant business opportunities, and there's some very interesting data and market analysis data starting to come out looking at the different biodiversity-based sectors. What's their share of the market? What's the market size? What's the growth rate? And what do we need to stimulate further growth? It's interesting to see also that the role of private capital in biodiversity investment is increasing. About $8.2 billion a year is the latest estimate, and that was 5 years ago. These figures are just to be updated. We'd expect to see this having risen significantly. Now, that's still much less than public capital, which is about 25 billion, but it's substantial, and it's substantial over many areas of investment. So I think we're starting to see the shift. We're starting to see lots of advice, case studies, approaches, methodology for leveraging that investment and capturing those high financial and social returns on investing in climate and biodiversity. But I think we do still need to ask ourselves, okay, now more than ever is the time to stop and consider the business risks of failing to invest, and equally looking at the opportunities that investing in biodiversity can bring. Clearly, the kind of work you and others are doing in terms of private finance, corporate actions, public-private community partnerships is going to be crucial. But what do we need to do, and what do we need to do at the bigger picture, policy, incentive, public framework level to enable and encourage and facilitate such actions and provide the support that's required? So thank you very much for your very kind attention.
Lucy, that was incredibly insightful. Thank you, because you presented 2 critically important perspectives. In addition to the dire statistics, you also offered a solution which is one that we hope and pray that governments and private sector will embrace. It is why we exist. Thank you for that, Lucy. Shirani, can we in relation to Q&A. Or maybe Hanan, if you could manage the Q&A, see what, if anyone has any questions, Shirani, you would like them to put it on the chat?
Yeah, on the chat box, or they can even speak up, unmute themselves.
Hi, Shirani and team. This is Denver. Well done. Congratulations, Dilhan, and the rest of the biodiversity team. It's very encouraging to see the progress. I recall Shirani reaching out to us at the very inception, having an array of questions that we posed as Virtusa joined and committed to the Carnelia Forest project. So having done the thank yous, a few suggestions. So, and also from a Virtusa point of view, ESG, environment, social, and governance, has become a key factor that Virtusa is going to expand and drive on globally. It's going to be incorporated as a part of our company's global strategy in the next 5 years. So in alignment to environment and the social aspects, I believe there is a lot that can be done. And the biggest challenge I see from a private sector. So everyone talks about ESG, but when it comes to measuring and quantifying and scoring, I think that's a little gray, or it's still new globally. It's not only for the Sri Lankan perspective, but if we, with the biodiversity and the rest of the team in Sri Lanka want to get ahead, I think we should look at all these investment opportunities where the private sector can come with a tangible output of a score that they're contributing to that is measurable. And by that, companies that are committed to be net zero, carbon neutral, positive, social impact with diversity, inclusivity, all those other aspects, right? So that we build the aspects of, climate resilience, health resilience, social resilience through these measures that we are doing, and address them in a way that is measurable with the output. Then those outputs should get audited and ratified by the reputed agencies to show that, yes, Virtusa or whoever the company has invested X amount of dollars, and this is what we want to get out of it. And this is the score that they can actually carry, which is auditable and accepted through the Carbon Disclosure Project or EcoVadis or wherever the rating agencies are. So I think that, accounting aspects needs to be looked into, and it's still new. So I think it's good for us to be ahead of the curve, if I've made that point. It's a lot of stuff, but I hope I was able to give that light. Thank you.
Thank you, Denver. Any other questions or observations that you would like to share? We have,
I've seen Ananda has put up a question on the chat. Maybe Ananda, you can unmute and speak up.
Thanks, Shirani. Thanks, Lucy, for this wonderful thought-provoking presentation. But I think we have been trying to provoke the thoughts of our higher-ups, mainly the people who are doing the budgets in Sri Lanka and the plans in Sri Lanka. But we are not getting adequate traction. Then part of us telling like, okay, start mobilizing youth and media and start bringing all this science in front of these other groups while you continue to do your advocacy as usually we do. So what's your global experience on this converting? Basically, I'm looking at the transformational change in this thinking. Over.
Shall I answer this?
Yes, Lucy.
Yeah, no, I think you make a really good point, Ananda, both in the chat box. Do you think we should mobilize youth or any other social segments on the concepts? Yes, I think we need our champions. Who those champions will be in a given case is, of course, going to vary, but we have to get that traction. And I think also this point you make, you know, to a large extent, business, and the previous speaker made this point as well, business is at the vanguard. Business is actually championing these, and business is bringing in the innovations. The corporate sector is taking on the innovations, but there's got to be the supportive policy frameworks in place to foster and enable that, you know, and as long as your investment incentives include, you know, ones which encourage you to invest in non-environmental technologies, then it's not going to make business sense. And I think that's the other thing, Amanda. In addition to getting the traction from the champions, there's got to be a supportive policy environment which is actually going to make it better business sense for people to make these investments. Those rewards have got to be trickling down.
Thank you, Lucy.
It's rarely that we have someone of Lucy's experience in our midst. So I would like to pose a question to you, Lucy. Technology is clearly a significant enabler in building climate resilience, but also in addressing some of the challenges. Do you see the potential in some of the technologies we are seeing from being trialed in Iceland and elsewhere in addressing some of the key issues?
Absolutely. And I think absolutely technology is going to be key, isn't it? You know, whether it is technology to minimize our ecological footprint in our land uses or production technologies or whatever, or, you know, low carbon, low emission technologies to help us. And I think we have to have that technology transfer. But if we're going to have it, then again, the financial investment support, even fiscal support, needs to be provided to enable it. And I think that's also where we need to look to new funding windows like the Green Climate Fund and others, which are putting in big bucks, which are putting in tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to support that kind of technology transfer. We need to aim big.
I think we have a question on the chat box.
Yeah. Since I am the only person representing the government at this forum, let me just give the perspective of the government. As you have highlighted these alarming factors for the private sector and the public sector to see, and then to give the economic value on these biodiversity losses. But, you know, if you really see the governments, you know, over the years, we were able to secure many green investments in large scales, or small scale, medium scale. Now, in my case, you know, I'm responsible for the water sector in the country, including the water distribution and watershed management. Now, at the moment, the portfolios I'm managing, the climate resilience, I'm talking only the climate resilience investment that we have tapped. From the world, from the Asian Development Bank, it's 967 million, almost $1 billion investment is making against climate resilience, taking trans-basin water to the north and the northern part, where unless otherwise if we make the water table appropriately managed, we will be by 240. The predictions are showing that, you know, that part of the country will be desert or something. So we are making investments now to prevent things happening in 240. And if you see that, you know, even latest World Bank loan that we have secured, 2 loans that we have secured. One is $75 million project, is on green financing component. This is to manage the water infrastructures and watershed management. And then the other one is climate resilience prevention, the CRIP. That's another $85 million. And then even grant funding, if you really see the grant funding of the recent past, where the Green Climate Fund is a major contributor at the moment. So we have tapped some of the projects to work with the private sector and with IUCN and UND. What we see is that, you know, I mean, when we really see even though sizable investments are being made by the government, all these loans have to be put by counterpart funds. Approximately they are financing up to 75%. Balance have to be put by the treasury. So, in and all, the governments with the other challenges are making sufficient investment. But if you really see the losses, biodiversity losses due to investments in shrimp farming and the so-called tourism investments by putting hot tourist attractions in waterfronts and making excessive use of water and excessive use of fertilizer. And actually, so the local private sector is not really working with us in achieving the long-term. The private sector is not the organized private sector like like biodiversity membership, but in the countries, the medium and even large scale, the private sector is not really working in line. So maybe there's a role for us to share that is, the governments are, despite all these challenges, governments are enoughly making investments, and whether the informal private sector is really working with the formal private sector with this foresighted views. So these are some debatable things because I manage in my portfolio, 72% of my investments I'm tapped from the green investments and making investments in the water sector. Just to share, your views are welcome. Maybe your advice, maybe your points, maybe enlightening all of us to look way forward. Thank you.
I think you're absolutely spot on, because actually the government is crucial. The government is crucial both in terms of setting the policy frameworks, but as you've said, as in terms of actually mobilizing large amounts of funding. Look at the Biofin study on biodiversity investments. $45 million a year being invested by the government in biodiversity is not pin money. That's substantial investment. And I sometimes feel also that's where ecosystem valuation can be so important, because very often there's so little awareness among other decision makers or policy makers of the return on the investments, the kind of investments you're talking about, which actually in terms of social, environmental, economic returns are massive. But, and this comes into the comment that was just made in the chat box by Nalin as well, so often the benefits of the kind of investments you're talking about are not actually reflected on the balance sheets. So there's very little recognition of these returns. I think there's no doubt it's got to be that partnership. It's got to be that private-public partnership that's going to take it forward. And if the public isn't there, then it's not going to get far. And I think also increasingly, you alluded to it, what we're seeing as being at the vanguard is some kind of a blended finance approach to environment and climate financing. I think it has to be. So I couldn't agree with your points more, nor also give you and your agency and sector recognition for the investments you're making from the public investment point of view.
Thank you very much, Anura. And thank you, Lucy. That was, the whole session was really illuminating, and we value that. And I think, your reference to ecosystem valuation, particularly having seen the Australian example, is really demonstrated the fact how that valuation can influence government policy. So thank you very much. So with that,